recording. All right. This is Rusty Thoughts for the November 9th Dwarf Day. If you're seeing this, we are a few weeks in the past, so we don't know everything from Foundations yet, but nothing that needs to be talked about yet. So we'll just be going through our question and answer segment for Rust, who will not be there on Dwarf Day. So,
Hi.
I guess the broadest and probably first question we should ask is, what do you think about the new meta, and where do you think Magda fits into it?
Um, so the new meta post bans,
Yeah.
I actually think it is one of the funnest times to be playing CDH just in general, which that may just be because of where our deck landed in the total like power scaling thing. Like if I was playing something like Corvold and I had to change my entire deck completely, sure I'd still play it if I'm dedicated, but like that sucks for a lot of people who are playing those style of decks that had to change.
Right.
Uh, But like I don't know, I really think the format is really good. It's slowed down. It's not as turbo focused anymore. You see a lot more mid range and stacks decks.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of interesting things as far as what people are trying to branch out and play, which I think is awesome. I think the more diverse the format gets, the better.
I mean, we got Urza back.
Right.
Dagson's on a tear, relatively.
Yeah. Arc of Daxon. What's the Esper dungeon deck,
Zephyrus.
Cypress.
Oh my God.
Separate, yeah.
Yeah, Ducky keeps putting
That
up
deck
numbers for those.
right now. And
Yeah.
I brought up Warfold just a minute ago, but like Warfold took down a pretty big tournament recently. Rather, I don't know if it took down, but I know it like top forward or something like that.
Yeah. Kona took a tournament down too. Mono green
Right.
stacks. So like it's a wild, wild west, and it's like in a good way, not like in a um, like these don't feel like bad decks that are winning. There seems like a lot of decks got just a little bit better because of these bans. Good enough to place, right? Is there any particular decks you think people should be looking out for? Like, you know, relative to Magda, like threats on the horizon.
So there's a lot of people who are, I mean, pretty rightfully so. The deck is really good right now. There are a lot of people going to Timna Thrasios, which didn't see a whole lot of play beforehand just because Green was in a rough spot and Breach was the best thing to be doing in the format, which I still think it is. I think Breach is still just like the most cracked thing that you could be doing. But people want to try new things. Tim Thrasios is the new hotness. Um, that deck has a lot of card advantage, especially with more of the meta being more like card advantage engine in the command zone kind of focused
Right.
for the mid range quote unquote mid range hell that we're in right now. I think that honestly, any deck that's going to prioritize Bowmaster, I know Obnixilis is also kind of coming back. I'd rather not coming back because like he's always been around, but like Obnixilis definitely got a huge upgrade in less so in its speed, but more so in its consistency. That deck is just so consistent right now.
And I think it's like a secret
I
buff, right? Because that was a problem
right,
that it had with it didn't have the consistency because it was trying to keep up with X or Y other thing that now everyone's a little bit slower, so it gets to play, a more grindy game.
right, and I think any deck that had a grindy game plan to begin with just got way better, regardless of uh, kind of the overall end goal of the deck. The only thing that I disagree with that statement on is Timnacrom, but that's just because they can't cast Crom as easily. Uh, like the Jolt Lotus and the Mana Crypt hands definitely hurt that deck, especially for I mean any Adnos style deck lost a lot of fast mana. That does not mean that these decks are not good. I think people overestimated the amount of effect that it would have on Tymnocrom and Roxai as far as like their Nas piles go, but those decks are still just top dog. Like Tymnothrasios, Roxai, and Blue Farm are definitely just still the best three decks in the format.
Yeah, and I feel like just Sese goes down, TNT goes up, and it's not a whole lot of change relative to those. At least for us, you still need to be aware that you're just going to lose the attrition game to card draw. You need to be aware that Rogsai is going to punish the greed, and we have to politic early and make sure that the table is playing a little bit more disciplined around someone who's just going to ship it on turn 2 and then ship it again on turn 3.
Right. I mean, it is a yapper's paradise right now.
Right. Well, it kind of
Uh,
always is, but especially now when
right.
because
So like,
skill and deck knowledge is going to be at a relative dip because people are trying a lot of new things. So knowledge versus decks is going to be lower, which means the power of politics grows pretty um, precipitously.
right. And that kind of leads into where I think our deck has landed specifically. I still think we're like a top five deck, but full biasness on display right now. But like, you don't play into a lot of the faults that those decks kind of prey upon, which is casting spells. Like,
Mm-hmm.
sure, you still need to cast all your stuff, but a majority of the things that you are casting that win you the game aren't going to be, creatures or just getting to the point where, sure, I set up on turn one and turn two and then didn't really do much for the rest of the game except crew and then kill him.
Right. Yep. And
So, like,
good.
not six study, not playing into the Mystic Remoras. Uh, and then on top of that, a lot of decks are not playing like artifact hate specifically just because Dockside is gone. So
Yeah.
you're seeing less collector, you're seeing less null rods, which is pretty good for us. Which it's good in the fact that it makes our wins a little bit easier, but it's worse in the fact of it stops your opponents. It doesn't slow down your opponents as much to when you didn't really care.
Right. And you just have one less avenue to stop your opponents from just doing the thing, developing or
Right.
when null rod becomes no longer a anti-development and an anti-win tool and it's more just an anti-development tool, it becomes less justifiable, and that means you just don't really, it's not the slam dunk that Blood Moon has become, right?
Now, so I guess I have a question. Is there a segment later on talking about a certain dragon from Lord of the Rings?
In the dwarf table, we can talk about that. Let's put a pin in that. We'll get to it. We'll talk about individual cards you want to bring up and talk about.
That's
Okay.
what I was checking. I'm just like, should I talk about this now? Should I talk about this later?
No, I'll make a segment at the end of this, and we'll talk about like individual cards you want to talk about. Okay.
Okay.
Um, actually, I mean, there we do have some card choices coming up. So, um, deck building is obviously being forced to change, not only because we've lost 3 cards, but because of those 3 cards leaving, we are also removing 5 or 6 to 10 other cards and then replacing them with other things. Um, how do you feel about the deck building changes as we shift into this new meta? Like specifically, if there's any card packages that you think are obsolete or are being slept on, or if there's any stacks choices that we need to like more heavily invest in, move away from, etc.
So as far as like how the deck changed around the bans, I know it was kind of. I've talked to a lot of people that said that losing Dockside hurt a lot, but in reality, I think that if you were using Dockside in the deck as like your number one win condition, because like don't get me wrong, Dockside was really good for but it was always like a plan C or a plan D type of thing, where I think a lot of pilots were using it as a crutch for not having like experience with the deck. So it forced a lot of people to make some decisions that they didn't really want to be making. Uh, for the new cards that we put in, uh, or rather, I guess just start to talk about like stuff that I think I probably don't play anymore. So like Curse Mirror was definitely the biggest like removal
Right.
because like biggest thing was you were copying other people's dock sides or just copying your own to kind of like quote unquote go up the tutor chain,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like Sisei style. Uh,
Yeah,
and then
exactly like that.
in that same vein, like Heat Shimmer and Twin Flame, and to a certain extent Dual Caster Mage because you kind of package all three of those together.
Yeah.
Uh, got so much worse.
Um,
Uh,
and to
there's
so, good.
still an argument to be made about all three of those specifically that I don't think you can make with Curse Mirror. I think Curse Mirror is probably just dead in the water at this point. There's really not anything you want to be copying for just a single turn that I think is going to be worth it.
Right.
Uh,
It's at least not already covered by other things, right? Because you have
right,
the other lines like the Zorn and the Academy Manufacturer or Roaming Throne, like you can still make copies of those with other things that are still in the deck, like
right,
Sculpting Steel and Mirror of the Forebears.
Right. You ultimately just get to the point where our chains are less about getting a particular card to chain up and more about getting five treasures to grab the next piece that is a treasure multiplier, and then you're using just your generic good treasure generator or treasure multiplier to make the next one better in like the Scourge of Valkus kind of way, which that those type of lines have always been good, and now we have better mid-range generators, so they just got kind of better. Even though we don't need Scourge, we apply the same kind of logic to how we progress through. I have this Academy Manufacturer, or I have Roaming Throne, and then I need to get Sword, and so on and so forth.
right. And the so that's one of the cards that I think that is actually a pretty good uh, like argument for keeping the copy effects. Talk about like Academy Manufacturer
Yeah.
because in the previous ban list like world, we were not playing that card because like the copy effects with it were pretty hard to come by.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about like double the Academy Manufacturer plus Zorn piles, those were pretty awful. And on top of that, like, oh my god, you fed Dockside so badly with your foods and your
Right.
that it just was not worth it. It was pretty terrible.
It was nega
But now the
insurances.
Dockside's gone,
Yeah.
right? So now the Dockside's gone, we have like a whole new world of possibilities with this thing
Mm-hmm.
in regards to just like having so much synergy with it. Because having Academy Manufacturer be a tutorable way to just kind of get card advantage that isn't the One Ring is
Yeah.
pretty huge. Um,
That it has additional synergy is the big thing, and that it
right. Because, like, I mean, I've played a pretty, I don't want to say a pretty, like, big handful of games, well, like, an amount of games where I had Academy Manufacturer, I was making a bunch of tokens, and then I drew Urza's Cave, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to go get Memory Vaults now and basically have Demonic Tutor every turn.
I feel like our synergy's gone up. Um, in like our median level of synergy has gone up, and our floors raised a little bit, and our ceilings lowered a tiny bit. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because
That's a really good way to put it.
because I think the next thing we should probably talk about is the fork packages and how those are much less attractive now relative to the, the there's still green tutors. They're just worse green tutor targets, right?
Well, I mean,
So that's
the
kind of,
sorry to cut you off, but the
oh,
other thing is like when you think about re-adding Academy Manufacturer, even though you're going down Cursed Mirror, because we now have three hits that we can copy, and get a lot of value from doing so, it actually adds consistency and raises the ceiling in some regards because there are plenty of board states where like you're actively going to be able to just win by having five treasures in an academy manufacturer. Like that's a thing.
Yeah. But I guess I wanted to ask Russ how he felt about forks in general right now.
So I know I kind of was like the pusher for forks, talking about like, I mean, just fork, reverberate, dual caster mage, that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
you and Shake for sure.
I think that while they were okay to begin with, I think they're just basically unplayable now. With the caveat of Flare of Duplication is still just the most cracked red card they've printed this year.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think it's just almost
Um,
always worth
it
it.
it is insane the difference between Fork and Flare of Duplication.
Right.
Sure, you have to sacrifice a dwarf. That kind of sucks sometimes, but like, oh my god, that card is insane.
Yeah.
As opposed to all the other ones where it's like you have to pay the mana no matter what. And on top of that, Dualcaster Mage is still just. I mean, if you're gonna play a fork, I think Dualcaster Mage might still just be the best one to play, just because of all the other synergy that it has with the deck.
Yep.
Uh,
And the fact that it
but
is
like,
harder to hit with counter spells.
also that right. There is some kind of argument for like if you can copy like an Eldritch Evolution or a Court of Calling, which are seeing a lot more play right now. But the problem is there's really not a whole lot that you're putting into play other than Roaming Throne
Right.
that are basically like the game on the spot.
Right. And
And most of the times, those cards aren't getting 4 drops.
right. And they have to, and the target have to be the right kind. Two is like the sweet spot, and then four is just not. Four is, sometimes it's four, but when they're going for like Seedborn, you can get 4+. But like other times, what are you grabbing? You're grabbing a dwarf,
Right.
or
I mean,
a
like,
Robodorf, like, and that's okay.
I mean, we also now get academy manufacturer as the three drop because like a lot of those decks aren't doing it on their rogue rack anymore because going and grabbing a two drop for a lot of these decks doesn't quite get them there. So, like you said, there's a lot of times where people are trying to get these Seedborn Muse, etc., and that still does enable the roaming throne, which is our ideal target.
Mm-hmm.
So even though they're not guaranteed to be the most useful thing in the world, green getting better technically makes it so that forks are stronger, but the conditions where those things are doing exactly what you want them to are fewer and far between than they were before because, going and copying something to get a dockside just won you the game.
Right.
Where now you need something a little bit higher ceiling wise. So if your opponent is going for, their porta calling X equals 2 or whatever to get their oof or to get, whatever, or X equals 3 to go grab a Manglehorn, like it's very specific as to when things need to happen because, if you do that as an example, you're if you go and you get a caddy manufacturer or whatever and they do grab a Manglehorn, then you just screwed yourself. But, there are plenty of other things that people are grabbing and it just because the meta has shifted a lot, it's not always like a guaranteed number. And we don't pivot very well between like 2 and 3.
Right. I I think another aspect of this is that we're talking about slots, and two or three extra fork spells actively interferes or actively competes for slots with the better new modal spells, the split second spells that protect Magda more often than not. by making her bowmaster proof or just swatting in general, right? And we kind of have the inevitability. We just need the space, and those cards help get us the space and give us a little bit of safety. Um, where before we were just jamming and hoping they either sandbagging until we had critical mass and they just couldn't do anything but watch us react to their stuff, or just jamming
Right.
and hoping they couldn't answer us. But now we have more tools to answer it at instant speed that isn't an opportunity cost because it's a modal instant spell, right? We have two of those and they don't seem like they're slowing down on printing those, and those just seem like they're better in general.
There's also a lot more things in the meta that you want to be able to remove
Yeah.
between that, 2 and 3 damage threshold.
Mm-hmm.
So like just generic burn tends to get better, outside of like Seedborn Muse and a couple other things,
Mm-hmm.
like it that range is very powerful.
So I want to pivot back to Cavern Horde Dragon because Russ brought it up earlier, and I wanted to give him a spot to drop that in here. How are you feeling at our great mid range hope here?
I think that card's really good. Uh, so the Cavern Core Dragon was like something that not a lot of people were playing before the ban.
Right.
Mostly because Dockside existed. Uh, a lot of people were very wary of beating Docksides, I would say. So it wasn't that great. But I will say, for me personally, right? Because I just didn't feel like the card did enough post pre-ban list. Having played it post ban list and having it been as good as it is, I wonder if not playing it beforehand was a mistake.
Um, as someone who lived in like the stacks mid range realm about a year and a half ago, before a lot of the deck lists started to converge a good bit on conventional wisdom, I was very high on the card. Like very high. I thought I liked it more than Gadrak in a lot of circumstances, and
Right.
way more than Goldspan. Goldspan's just a pet for me. Um, and yeah, no, it consistently makes 3 or 4. Um, and um, because people are less worried about feeding Dockside, 2 mana and 2 mana rocks are a little bit more common now, right? And those things stick around. Or the Thrasios decks are happy to run Signet style cards, um, and that's a boon for us because they can't just crack in response in the same way that Dockside kind of made you play scared and cautious all the time.
Right.
So
And
let's
like,
what's the minimum number where you're happy? I think for me it's like probably 4.
um, I mean, so if I just have like Cavern Core Dragon, like let's say I'm not doing some kind of like tutoring for it, just hard casting it from my hand. I think if I'm being discounted by three, I'm not too happy with. But like, if it happens, it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Four is probably the sweet spot, and then five is just crazy.
Right.
Five
5 plus
plus
is,
it.
yeah. That's exactly how I feel. It's probably the same uh, evaluation we gave it when it first came out. 4 is like where you're like super happy, and then 5 is just everything past that's just awesome. Is there any
I
other?
mean, there
Oh god.
is like if this thing hits and makes two treasures, this is cracked.
Right. 2 is a fantastic number. 2 is more than Goldspan, and it
Right.
usually costs the same amount as Goldspan.
Exactly.
Um, so because they won't necessarily crack it in response to they can't crack it in response to the cast because the cast already happened. Um,
Exactly.
and cracking in response to you hitting them is usually good for you, because it sets them back on tempo. Um, if it's a treasure, we're assuming like TNT like Lotho kind of card, Lotho kind of space. Um, that's where a lot of the treasures are coming from. Um, is there any other cards that you think people should be that you're not on that you think people should be testing right now?
As far as new cards go,
It doesn't necessarily need to be a new card. It's a card that you think people should be brewing with and putting in their list and giving it a good shake.
right? I mean, Academy Manufacturer, obviously, um, Cavern Dragon. I think that if people are not playing, and obviously the deck is so like customizable that this is even a hot take in itself. Uh, I think that if people are not playing Warping Whale, it's not necessarily a mistake, but that card got way better.
That's actually where I wanted to go next. You think it is like almost an auto include?
I mean, for me, yes. Like that there is full biasness in saying that I think Warping Whale should just be auto include territory, just because of how much of the format that it currently answers in both forms of it's 2 mana, just exile any 1X or X1. So it hits Bowmasters and Dranith, which are the big two.
Or two
It
of the big
also
three, really. Yeah.
right. Um, Bowmaster Dranith, and then it can also hit
Haven.
right, like even Mind Sensor is becoming more prevalent. It can hit that. It can hit. I mean, people are still playing Dauntless Dismantler for some reason.
Yeah.
The other thing is like sorceries are huge right now. The ability to just counterspell, uh, Calling Ritual being the big one. Toxic Deluge is also kind of coming back in full swing.
Yeah.
Uh, just hitting like Grim Tutor or Demonic Tutor or even Imperial Seal. Like
Yeah.
hitting tutors is actually really huge.
It also hits Dam, which is like Esper controls on an upswing. Although, um,
A
how
huge one right now because Kinnan is actually rampant through the meta right now. There is so much Kinnan.
right?
And the fact that it hits Transmute Artifact and Fabricate,
Uh, yeah.
I mean, that actively won me a game in the like 80 plus something tournament in Waco. I warping whaled somebody's Transmute Artifact and then I untapped and won. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I played a game earlier today where somebody mystical tutored for calling ritual for like a game winning calling ritual, and none of the other two blue players in the pot had anything, and so the warping whale was the only thing that saved us that game.
The question is, no, I guess yeah, that's really the only card that really answers that. So that's fair enough. Um,
Another thing,
mhm.
this is kind of in the same vein, but it's a lot more basic, I guess. I think Tybalt's trickery is also really good right now.
I think most people are playing it, and I think for obvious reason, it just answers everything. And
Right,
usually, like, I'm not that scared of the McKinnon Big Flip. I mean, I have in fact given someone a Hullbreaker horror, but that's not most games.
right,
And you
and
could,
that's kind of something to keep in mind. A
right?
lot of people, whenever they hit like their Tibble trickeries and their wild magic surges, which I'm going to be honest, I still don't like wild magic surge for this reason, but that's we'll talk about that later.
Mm-hmm.
Tybalt's trickery hitting something that just like hoses you or puts somebody else in a game winning position, that's just variance. You cannot be upset that, oh, I Tybalt's trickery this thing and then lost to it anyway. It's like, yeah, that just happens. That is the game of magic.
Right. Usually, it's I counter spell the the monolith, and I get the thing that he would have flipped into anyway, and I'm just like, oh no, like it was a, it just happened. Like it was gonna happen, but not for that interaction
Right.
anyway. Um, the blue players shouldn't have sandbagged or misused their interaction if that was what they were worried about. Like red players
Exactly
playing
right.
counterspell is just gravy for the table, and if it sometimes saves the game, that's great. If it sometimes lets the game that was going to be a loss, that's also okay. Um, so you are still pretty much just like this is an A plus card with whale.
No, I think Warping Whale is fantastic. Um, I will bring up with both Magus of the Moon and Blood Moon basically becoming auto includes at this point, just because of how badly they punish the meta right now.
Right,
There is a real cost to playing Warping Whale if you put a Blood Moon in play,
right.
because unless you were getting like Soul Ring or Liquid Metal Torque, you are hurting for colorless so bad.
Yeah, that's actually something I hadn't considered over much. It, I feel like the fact that we added a couple lands gave us the freedom to add a couple of reds and not go down our makes red and colorless or just makes colorless lands. So like
Right.
playing Warping Whale became less of a problem. It wasn't like a deck building cost, more like a deck building choice at that point. Um,
Exactly.
and one of our big conversations for Dwarf Day is going to be the nature of the choice between a Warping Whale mana base and a Winter Moon mana base, and how they feel more or less mutually exclusive, at least for consistency's sake. Not that you can't run both, just that if you do run both, both are going to feel uh, suitably
Gonna feel bad.
suboptimal. Right. They're gonna feel decidedly suboptimal compared to like building the ideal version of either land base. I just kind of wanted to see where you felt like that, um, where the choice between Winter Moon and Warping Whale comes down for you.
So, like you said, it is a choice. There's not necessarily a wrong answer, just because we always talk about the deck is so highly customizable to each different player's play style that you can basically do whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
I personally don't like Winter Moon because I think that the numbers behind it of your basic land count being what it needs to be limits you um, on the good like value lands that you get to play.
Sure.
So like, and for a deck that is monocolor, it sometimes struggles with having advanced engines. Having some of your lands provide that to you is huge.
Yeah, I can see that.
And on top of that, with even though the moon effects are higher in the meta right now, um, decks are still not playing a ton of basic lanes to combat that. So yeah, Winter Moon can get them, but at the same time, with everybody slowing down, a lot of the good plays that a lot of people are making are just in the 1, 2, or 3 mana range as
Mm-hmm.
far as like impactful plays.
And they're setting up with they're setting up for
Right.
less mana and still being able to break not break parity, but like
Right.
generate value
On
over
top of
time.
that, Winter Moon is still doing nothing against all the mana rocks that a lot of decks put in because Dockside is no longer in the format.
Right.
Um, and again, I am the first to admit that I am completely biased in this conversation of Warping Will versus Winter Moon. It's just that there is some thought behind it. It's not just I picked this one, I don't pick that one.
Right. No, for sure. And I can definitely see the I for me, and this is me speaking personally, whale has always been like a dubious like 1 in 100 type card, where like the counterspell game is not like the depth that I'm looking for, and I feel like we just keep getting more good removal spells. So it's hard for me to justify screwing with the mana base to facilitate it, especially when we know that moon effects are so damn backbreaking right now, and
Right.
it's sort of like the land slot discussion using command beacon versus homeward path in like a in a kind of abstract way. Like it needs to be
Oh, Bushy
powerful.
speaking all day.
It needs to be a what's that?
Sorry, no, nothing. Good, continue.
So we talk about like if it's not suitably powerful in its specific niche, especially if it's a reactive card, it needs to be searchable in the deck, right? And Winter Moon is both searchable, kind of ubiquitous, and proactive. So it checks a lot of boxes in terms of like the am I sad to see this right now? Um, because its effect will be ubiquitous. You're not going to turn off just two of the people at the table like you used to do with Blood Moon. It kind of hurts everyone equally, and it's able to be used whenever you draw it every single time, and it'll pretty much always have an okay to great effect. And I think that's the way that we're looking at it, and the opportunity cost is just don't run the crime lands that don't do anything, run mountains instead. Um, and as someone who's not had a whole lot of like hits with Crime Magda, despite her just being kind of an excellent card and a good win con or backup win con, um, like that's not necessarily a good enough reason not to run like possibly like the third or fourth best stacks piece in the deck. Does it make sense?
Right. Um, and that's kind of something too. It's like it really depends on where you want to put your synergies.
Right. Before we move on to the last bit of the lands, is there any other interaction do you think that people should be toying around with aside from like the obvious siege smash and untimely malfunction?
So those cards are crazy. I'm glad you brought those up. I really wanted to talk about them. It's just as far as like, hey, people play these things.
Yeah,
They're so good.
there was a time where
Uh,
like sudden shock was a fringe playable just because of slots, and people were like not
no,
getting how good split second was. They understood how good not using the stat or not using spells were vis-a-vis the uh, twin shot sniper, but the fact that
right,
uncounterable two damage it didn't click with people necessarily, or it didn't like rank high enough to where they could drop another card for it. Now we're in a position where we can
well, that's
run three more.
like like a good example of that is like today even I was playing a game where I was feeling like nobody could touch me. I had basically they needed six different forms of interaction to stop me,
Mm-hmm.
but in reality it was just the one because the mirror match had sudden shock, and I was like, okay, it didn't matter.
Yeah, and
Like
those get you
just the fact that it can go from they need six pieces of interaction, I am untouchable, to oh yeah, I'm just losing the game now.
right, and we're usually the person with that answer, right?
Right,
I never the like it never doesn't feel it never feels completely useless. That it's never trinket text. It's always no, you don't get to use your Dothy, right? Or no, you don't get
right,
to activate in response. Your Thrasios is just dead. Um, your combo's over. You can't just cannon on top of it, right?
exactly.
And that's just so powerful. Um, like and now that cannon's so powerful, right? The fact that we're running sudden shock and siege smash, and we have the ability to hit either side. We have basically two options to hit either side of that combo without them being able to combo over it is incredible. Um, is there any other interaction that you could think of? Because we've kind of like we're kind of lower on forks and spells like that aside from RTF
Right.
and Flare. So what is there any other class of cards that we need to talk about?
I'm still really high on Blast Sacked. I've been generally impressed with Jessica's Will as well. Um,
Yeah,
More so as just mana accelerant and not for the card advantage it provides. Um, I will always talk about Dead and Gone if given the chance. Dead and Gone is always just fantastic.
I still own it. I don't know. I feel like Whale makes more. I to me, I just think I did this show earlier that I saw that Whale was like a better Dead and Gone, but maybe there's an argument to be made that um, like if I can't kill it, I can remove it for a turn is just good enough, even for 3 mana.
Right. I mean, because like the biggest thing about Dead and Gone is that there are some times where like your burn is just not going to kill that Elvish.
Right. Yeah. In the stacks ma-
So what do we do
in the
about it?
white X stacks max matchup, you are in a bad time. You're having a bad time in general. Yeah.
Right. Where it's like, I can't do anything about this Yasharn that's in play because I only have three sources of burn.
Right.
All right, pick it up.
Pig is big. Right. That's a fair point. Although I feel like Chaos Warp and Zoyoa's has given us a lot of reach there.
Yeah, those cards specifically have given us a lot of leeway with that. Oh, okay, I've got another one. So this one, this one kind of goes into the Warping Whale camp because I don't know if you can play both of these cards
Sure.
in the Winter version.
Yeah.
Uh, Specifically, the combo package of Urza's Cave and Talon Gates of Madara.
I'm currently running a moon land base and running both.
So
Okay, interesting.
the interesting thing, Rust, is that since a majority of lists went up at least 2 raw lands, the deck building cost behind going to either Warping Whale or Wintermoon is pretty negligible because
Yeah.
like with your list specifically, right, you have a 66% chance to hit 2 lands in general. You have a 31% chance to hit both as red, and then you're guaranteed to have at least one colorless source like 70% of the time. So very often you're going to have, 1 red, 2 lands guaranteed at like close to 50%. Um, Whereas when you're moving down to Winter Moon, seeing 2 mountains in your first like 7 in general is like 25%, which isn't terrible if you're on like 13 to 14 uh, actual mountains. And as you start going, to your first 10 cards, it's close to 45%. So it's like the realistic amount of mountains that you need to play Winter Moon and just break parity. Because, like you said, a majority of the stuff in our deck is only 1 to 3 CMC, right? So the fact that you only need 2 mountains allows it to be run a lot more easily, especially into the current meta where outside of some of the Signet stuff, almost every deck, including 2 color decks, are still between 2 and 4 basic lands.
Mm-hmm.
So like you don't need to go to the 16 to 18 range for mountains. Like because we were able to go up 2 more base lands and then you swap out the crime lands, which are relatively inconsistent when you have Crime Magna out for consistency to enable Wintermoon. Like Drew said, Wintermoon is a 2 mana spell similar to um, Warping Whale. Obviously, not an instant cast, but the fact that you can use this as a potential tutor target, it's probably going to see as many tutor times as you would a Cavern Horde Dragon because that's not often going to be a choice, but it is a choice in some of these niche situations, right?
Right.
Um, But yeah, as far as like the mana base goes, because of the changes to the deck from the bans and how people have adapted things, it just becomes easier to run either of them. Like Drew said, there's next to no deck building cost outside of the fact that you might have to run Tarnished Citadel and Ramumap Ruins instead of like two mountains or something. So that you
Right.
have the opportunity cost to go and grab the colorless if or have colorless enabled to be used.
Right.
Um, at a very small downside because our life total in most situations doesn't matter.
Yep.
But yeah, like the land base is almost negligible for either of them at this point.
But they're just mutually exclusive.
In a way, um, the math behind seeing a colorless source available to you with only 10 colorless lands is still close to 50%. So it's not like it's not online. It's just
Right.
slightly less common.
Yeah.
And even then, at like 53% chance for one colorless,
Mm.
at 10 base lands, I mean, if I go and I look at my own deck right now, which with Winter Moon, if I go and look at the turbo deck that I just made for someone else that has basically the same land base, I'm on, Ancient Tomb, Cavern of the Souls, Command Beacon, Fomori Vault, Gemstone Cavern, Holdout Settlement, Mutavault, Survivors, Talon Gates, Treasure Vault, Urza's Cave, Urza's Saga. That's 12. And that's on
Right.
a
And
land
I
base that can technically go for Winter Moon as well. So like at 12, you're
right.
at 60.7% to have a colorless source in your opening hand. So like it's still technically possible to run both, which is kind of actually interesting now that I think about it.
I think we might have to bring that up during the day. What's your thoughts on that, Rust? Would you run a slightly less than like I'm not saying all in, but like there is obviously a point of diminishing returns in terms of adding extra basics or extra colorless
Colorless.
sources, and you obviously can't get to the point of diminishing returns or like at that break point for both at the same time. Do you think it's worth just deciding one's going to be online more than the other and just accepting that if you were to run both?
So so the biggest thing with winter specifically, right, is that I am so like as the more like mid range like control style build,
Yeah.
I am so interested in just jamming all of my stuff really early as far as like trying to either build I don't want to say like a turbo win, but like you do want to establish yourself in the early game while still holding up everything. So there's a very there's a very tap out versus like act of what you want your stuff to do. And that balancing act basically progresses the entire game. Because it's like, do I cast let's say, do I cast this random two drop dwarf that I had and hold up one removal spell, or do I just continue with the setups that I do have and hold up two or three removal spells? Which, if you are doing Winter Moon stuff, I think that decision gets made for you, and that's just not the play style that I tend to go for.
Right. I mean, they're both tempo plays, right? And one's a little bit riskier, and one's a little bit has a higher ceiling, probably. The but also has a
Right.
much lower floor. Like going one for one and then like a tempo control style is just always going to be a if you hit the jackpot and hit the right thing and you close someone's window on them, that's always going to feel better than people getting closed out of a game early and then eventually being able to build themselves out of it and you lose the game. Like that's gonna like those hits and misses are going to feel a little bit different, but because I think you're gonna be pretty hyper aware of the fact that you used Warping Wail to stop a win, or like that kind of card to stop a win. And if you don't win after a turn one or turn two Winter Moon, you're gonna feel like, well, does this card give them too much space to maneuver, right, over time? And is that worth it versus having another good silver bullet in your hand?
Yeah, I mean that's like a very fair question.
I think
Uh,
psychological too, not just like a raw data thing.
right. And then on top of that, like, and that's kind of why I preface playstyle and just the raw customization of the deck
Yeah,
whenever I talk about some of this, because like I mean it does always just come down to personal choice.
yeah. I think I agree with you on that. And currently, I'm a little bit higher on Moon, if only because I favor asymmetrical, proactive, and um, one for many style cards. Just in general, I think it's just the way CDH
Right.
uh, feels most
That's
comfortable
something
for me.
that I because the like I'm more so kind of like just waiting my time for the one moment where this one interaction spell is going to do the thing, and then I try to capitalize on that, as
Right,
opposed to trying to break parity on a stacks piece or something like that.
right. I'm not sure what I find, and this is actually pretty interesting. The difference between like a tempo control style Magda versus a turbo stack style Magda. Um, like I feel like one a lot of the turbo stack style difficulty comes in meta deck knowledge and then mulliganing and like being very both disciplined in play. But I think the control tempo style requires a shit ton of discipline in play and making sure you're hitting the very correct pinpoint accurate spots for your interactions so that your one for ones are the best one for ones you could have possibly gotten.
Right.
And
I mean,
I
so
think one's
that's
harder.
on with other people who are piloting the deck. They'll be like, "Watch my games, then tell me how I do." And it's always interesting watching from outside of the game
Mm-hmm.
because you'll see people making gameplay decisions that you don't necessarily agree with,
Mm-hmm.
and you get to see how that works out for you. Um, and one of the biggest things, whenever I do end up, watching some of these games that people play, I always try to make sure that I'm not looking at other people's hands for information because then I get outside information that I normally don't know otherwise. Like if I know none of my opponents have a counter spell and I'm sandbagging a bottle cap blast, well, now that I know they don't have a counter spell, I'm just like, okay, you should jam it here. Okay, you should jam it here. As opposed to the TNT player has 5 cards in his hand, maybe you don't cast this.
Right. You're playing an odds game even if you're a spectator, and that's a good way to look at it because you don't just jamming when the blue player is like full grip. You're just likely to get blown out.
Right.
All right. That was kind of a sidetrack to the whole land question. We one of the last things we're going to talk about is shop. And Mishra's Workshop is an interesting card that doesn't seem like it fits cleanly in a. It's less about a land base. It's less of a land based question. It's more of like a this card can brick your hand. How do you make the peaks maximize the peaks so that the bricks that you have to ship um, hurt less or are acceptable mulligans in a world where one of your lands does nothing sometimes. So I don't think you're running it right now, correct?
I am not running it.
Yeah.
I run it in the past. Um, and it was never like even when I was running it in the past. Sure, it was fine when you oops, I drew Portal to Phyrexia, or oops, I drew Godfair's statue, and this thing helps me cast this.
Right.
Or it's really good in games where oh man, I have Mishra's Workshop Lotus Petal in the Wonder Ring, or something like that, or
Right.
you're casting your Torpor Orb on turn one in response to a Grog side player, going second.
Right.
The problem is most of the artifacts that you have in your deck aren't high impact enough that I think warranting a land that is essentially dead after getting that artifact into play is worth it.
I think that's kind of where I'm at right now as well. I I don't think there's enough combination of artifacts where like getting that big boost turn 1 or 2 is worth like the effective missing a land drop for the rest of the game that it turns out to be.
Correct.
And I think most pilots have come to the conclusion that the 456 sixers that aren't GPS aren't quite there right now. And it's not because we lost man acceleration. It's just because honestly the cards don't do enough, and we can run more efficient versions by way of more vehicles, more artifact dwarves that
Right.
do exactly what we want at the mana value that's reasonable for them, without having to rely on just basic synergy to make the card worth 6 mana.
So something that I kind of want to touch on,
Okay.
there is a slot that I do have for Workshop if I were to play it, and that card is Crystal Vein.
Yeah.
I know some people are preferring City of Traders over that slot, but I prefer Crystal Vein just because it will always produce mana no matter what.
Right. Well, it's
I
just
don't have to worry about
good.
I don't have to worry about oh, I ran out of artifacts. This land doesn't do anything. Or I don't have to worry about this was the only land in my hand. Once I play my second land, whenever I get it, I'm still essentially just at one land drop kind of thing.
Right. It it
Um,
never
and
bricks
then it's
hands.
still also right. The only way that it can brick a hand is if your hand needed a red source and it just didn't have it.
Right.
But in that case, the Mishra's Workshop wasn't doing anything for you either.
Right. Nor was any other either filter utility land or just pure utility land that does something specific. This card was no
Right.
different than those,
Uh,
but on
so the
occasion
thing that I really
it's a 2 mana spell. It's a 2 mana spell on turn 1 sometimes.
right. So the thing that I really like about it is that you can use it as just a land drop that, sure, it's making color, but you can really utilize it as like a turning the corner point.
Uh-huh.
If you're like, man, I just need that one extra mana somewhere.
Yeah, no, it absolutely can be like, say you have a Jessica's and a Reb in your hand, and it's like turn 3 and you've played Magda, and you can sack it to get that Jessica's Will out and still have counter magic for the for the Reb, and that's like an attractive play pattern because you're gonna get such a mana swing likely that you're going to be able to play something really impactful on the back end, or multiple things,
Right.
and that's useful.
Because it's good in the late game because it's helping you maintain the mana consistency without using your treasures.
Right.
But it's also really good in the early game because it's helping you turbo out stuff if you really need to turbo it.
Right. I mean,
Like if you
yeah.
if you were just so dependent on getting out, like I mean, so the biggest thing that you can do with it is let's say you just have Chromox Crystal Vein or Lotus Petal Crystal Vein or even Simian Spirit Guide Crystal Vein. All three of those combinations of cards just lead to a turn one blood moon.
Right. And we since we're on the kind of on a critical mass of like let's make one mana, let's make one red mana cards, except for like mana, except for Mox Amber. Like we're in a pretty good spot
Right.
on that end, and let's be because Mox Amber doesn't do anything unless you're playing Rog. Um, Turn one at least.
I mean, there are like turbo stacks versions of the deck that their game plan is basically that they expect Magda to stick around where that is going to be useful for them. And also, like, as much as I don't want to admit it, it does the fact that Workshop enables some specific early turn one to turn three plays in pods against um, decks that we're not good against, like turbo decks.
Mm-hmm.
Even if those hands are few and far between, they still exist more consistently with that card in the deck. But as a player, I understand that, or as someone who really appreciates the mathematical value of a card, I also understand that the mathematical value is very low.
Right,
Um,
because
so like even if you were to have, that damping sphere, trinosphere, sphere of resistance, thorn, and torpor orb package, as far as like stopping the Rogsai early,
huh,
it's still not very high. It's still like a 2 to 6%, depending on, if you're only counting your first seven cards or if you're mulling down to six or five or whatever. Um, but no matter what, you always are at a very low number.
right,
Unless you're thinking about like, here are all of my artifacts. And in order to make the card mathematically feel like it's a good option, you have to consider, okay, well, this is in my hand. What is the rest of my options in my deck that will like technically be good? Um, because if you think about the fact that you have to draw that card to begin with, it's definitely makes the math look terrible. But if you have the card in hand, well, okay, what is enabled by this being here?
and usually the math I go for there is how many more hands does this enable than it bricks, and the math isn't super favorable. It's somewhere around like what 55, 60%,
Or what?
where like 60% of the time you'll get like a favorable hand of being able to play out an artifact on above curve, right? Or a couple artifacts. That's fairly low odds, and
It's between if you only want one artifact, it's between 63 and 77%, depending on the mana value you're looking at for the
right,
artifact itself. And then if you want two or more, it's between, 22 and 50%.
right,
Um,
and this is like one of those things like the marginal value. There are game states where like getting one artifact, or you're getting one artifact with the specific one that you got was enough, and Mishra's workout did this thing. But also, there are other cards that get you the two mana you need, which is kind of the breakpoint mana wise for turn one artifacts. For most of them, because most of us are off three ball and off of orb and off of Uba Mask, right?
right. But
So
even
Well,
on like
I'll
Thorn
tell
of
you what.
Amethyst and Sphere of Resistance specifically, like if you don't even consider Trinisphere, like you're saying, there's a lot more hands that get you to two to play your Damping Sphere, your Sphere of Resistance, your Thorn of Amethyst, your Torpor Orb, your Vexing Bauble early because you need something else as well.
right,
All that stuff still exists, and you don't necessarily need Workshop to turn those on.
right, and that's
But they still require you to have other things. Like you still need to go land into Soul Ring into Damping Sphere, or
right.
you need to go, Mox Opal, not Mox Opal, Mox Diamond or Lotus Petal or Chrome Mox plus a land, so that you can enable these things. Um,
Right, but the I guess the big stipulation there is that none of those cards that you just listed, they don't brick. They usually are enablers for hands that would have otherwise been bricked, whereas Workshop is trying to find a higher peak in very specific hands, and its trade-off is that it's having a much larger percentage of hands, where instead of actually being value added to the hand, it's value subtracted, and it actually
right.
bricks the hand. And for
So
me, that 22 to 50% is that big gulf of value that makes shop more spooky and less and not good enough in as far as like output randomness for
right.
me.
I will say though that like if you know, like Russ said, there are a lot of different ways to play the deck, and if your play pattern it consists of turn one stacks piece, turn two stacks piece, turn three Magda into then your Magda game plan, like the value changes
Yes, it does.
as far as your play patterns go. But
Yeah.
if like that's what your goal is to begin with, regardless of if, your hand looks to turbo out or whatever, if you're looking
Mm,
for those early stacks pieces, regardless, then the downside of shop is a lot less, but it definitely does brick those hands where you're like, this would have been a turbo hand if I didn't have this workshop in it. What the hell?
right, right. It feels like it's like a
That's
divergent requirement.
about
You what, Rust?
um, the other thing to kind of think about is that for a lot of the decks that are playing like the cost
Increase?
additive cards, spear resistance, thorn of amethyst, stuff like that. If you are using a workshop to put one of those into play, you're losing that game.
Or it's
You
a
took a
draw.
whole turn to shoot yourself.
Right, because it like you just don't break parity into those situations unless you are like unless everything you're casting is an artifact, but that's just not how Magda works.
Right. But also,
Right.
like, you also have to consider that it doesn't necessarily need to be a turn one play either. So, like, even though it's most impactful in the first couple turns, like, if you have other things that you need to establish before you start restricting resources from your opponents, then it's still technically viable.
Mm,
It also becomes very pod dependent, though,
yep.
because depending on what you're playing against, obviously your opponents can generate quite a bit of value on the board already. And if you're looking to restrict their, you know, plays moving forward, doing so from turn three on doesn't have as big of an impact, specifically for like the one cost increasers, right? But if like you're playing a Trinisphere or something instead, like that's a different story.
Hmm.
Um, but again, that goes back to, you have less than a 1% chance to see shot plus Trinisphere, so
Yeah,
it it's still not usually an argument to be able to be made, in my opinion, as well.
I think I agree. So, um, wrapping up, I just wanted to ask you, buddy Rust, if there was any other like big thoughts you have about Magda building, brewing, piloting in this new era of CEDH.
So Show can attest to this. I am such like a. I mean, I have been called a crackhead deck brewer so many times by various different people because you look at my list and it's always like updated 5 minutes ago, updated an hour ago. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm just constantly trying out new things. I'm constantly in limbo of I don't think the deck is perfect. There's that one card that I don't vibe with. I need to find the perfect slot for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am always making changes. I don't think I've changed my deck list since the basically since the ban list happened, outside of like one card. Like
So,
is how stable I'm feeling about the deck right now.
so I think it's reasonable to say, and I think I agree with this, that after you decide on a couple of build decisions, a lot of cards are feeling very, very good in slot. If that makes sense.
Right.
Okay. I mean, it sounds like it's good. I mean, it sounds good for us. And something else that's sticking out to me is that it feels like more variability of the deck is viable right now than it was 3 months ago. Because it feels like more. It feels like we're seeing a lot of decks do different things and still top.
Right.
And it's not just like Gruel Stavo that's doing the oddball thing and still putting up numbers, right? It's a lot of diversity.
Anyone.
His deck is real
Right.
weird.
It
Not gonna lie.
hey, you know,
It certainly works for him, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's hard stacks with no Maskwood Nexus and no backup lines. So it's like you have to be really confident in your ability to pilot the deck that way, uh,
yeah,
to build it that way. And if you as a pilot are comfortable in that space, then go for it.
yeah,
But a lot of people don't like not having backup lines or don't like having safety nets. We've had tons of arguments about Spine of Isha, right? And no matter what, like half of us just come back to it like this just answers so many problems that we come up with, even if they're few and far between. All those situations that are few and far between come up more often than you might actually think.
right. And just having the answer in a top four pod, it matters. Um, anything else for?
Rust, what do you think of Godrak?
Oh yeah, yeah. That's a good point.
I think he is an interesting card currently because of the amount of like value that he gives as far as I mean basically all the like different play patterns you can have. Whether it's just you're using the card as advantage of like, do they block my dwarves and give me extra treasures? Um, do I, use Portal to Phyrexia and then use it as like some kind of like big bomb? That kind of thing. It also just makes all of our removal a little bit better. I personally am not on it because I think that it requires too many extra pieces, so to speak.
Yeah,
Um, which is again more so a personal play style kind of thing. I know some people who have been playing it and they have been ranting and raving like this card's insane. It's gotten me so much extra value. It's really good against the Timna meta still, and it's just good. Um, I don't know.
well, it's one of my favorite cards because it's a 3 mana dragon, and
Right,
it plays like a standard card. Um, it really feels like a card where you just get to play smart and utilize and have a lot of variability in the ways you can use it smartly. And that just that's a good dopamine hit when you play it and utilize it effectively. But it also just feels like even it feels like a better magmatic galleon in that sense because even though it's occupying one less slot in that it can't tap your dwarves, it gets you a similar level of like additional treasures for 2 less mana and happens to block Timna attackers, which is a big up on it.
right. Um, I've lost my train of thought.
Well, that's
I
okay.
think like the fact that you can just jam it, even if it's not the ideal time, like
And it just becomes a Sarah's Ascendant level threat.
potentially.
Right. It's a Sarah's Ascendant level threat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Got
Uh, the thing that I wanted to mention,
yeah.
what you were talking about of like this card is a feels good moment because it feels like a standard card. Like it gets the dopamine hit of like, doing the thing, I guess.
Right. Because you can follow
I
up. You got
that I feel that way with Blasphemous Act because Blasphemous Act is such a card you expect to see in like the most casual of tables.
sure.
Like, why is this thing played in a CDH game? Like, who's casting this, right?
Yeah.
And then in the board states where you end up casting it, your opponents are like, "Thank God somebody is playing this board wipe."
So I get that, and that's something we need to talk about in a Dwarf Day in a longer context in terms of how to how to effectively manage tempo and the responsibility and the role of a Magda, even a tempo Magda, at the table. And to me, killing creatures, killing all creatures, isn't necessarily something we should be relied on to do. I don't think it's a
Oh,
good
absolutely.
gotcha. It's just one of those things where it's not necessarily like I think in like the Brewers, in like the Brewers advantage sense, it doesn't actually win us points. It loses us points because people aren't going to like play cautiously around Magda ever for this. But um, if we become known as the deck that still runs Beact and Mizia Mortars, like that could be um, a reason for people to not be respectful at the table around these large board states. And instead of countering things, there's like, well, Magda can just blow it up because they have the removal.
The problem is when we're talking about how bad a land is because it's a 1 in 99 and what that impacts things. Our board wipes being 1 in 99, they can't rely on us having that. We're not a blue deck. We can't mystical tutor it to the top of our
Right.
library.
And we're not, most of us aren't incoming.
So the fact that you can be like, hey, we've seen 10 cards. Okay. This card is like maybe a 2% chance to be seen.
Sure.
Like, I don't have it. I don't have a one ring. I can't draw extra cards. I don't have a smuggler's copter out to like try to dig. This Even if we're known as having those cards, we can just be like the math says it's not possible for us to like or for you to actively rely on us for that.
That's fair. It's a useful rhetorical strategy there. It brings me back to what was his name? E was talking about how like um, you just can't let the table ever assume you're going to play remotely responsibly or have a tempo game plan that relies on removing things proactively instead of like at the last moment. So it's a interesting like gameplay philosophy situation whether you even want to jam that stuff, right? Whether it's your job to pack a board wipes.
Right.
Um, and despite this being a good conversation, it was a conversation we started at 11 p.m. So it is now after midnight, and it is uh, very much time for me to hop off, which means the recording is going to end. Um,
Lame.
I know. We could go on for the 2 hours, which means we would have two dwarf days for the price of one, which we're still basically going to have. Russ, thanks for splitting your attention between the road and this conversation. Thanks for making the time, and thanks for your
I
insight.
mean, it was a 117-mile straight shot. Thank you for giving me something to do.
Yep, absolutely. I know how Texas roads can be. Um, um, I guess the only thing I can say is I hope everyone else enjoyed their dwarf day or will enjoy their dwarf day if they're seeing this ahead of the event or before they've watched the full VOD. And get your Google form in so you can be entered into for the drawing because that will end on the 16th. All right, have a good night.